Every week when we gather here, we spend some time together looking at what the Bible has to say about any particular topic or a story or what have you. It's a commitment we made at the very beginning that the Bible would be a source of authority for us. It would be something that we'd follow and listen, and we would allow to guide us through our lives. But the Bible is a complicated collection of documents. It represents many thousands of years of human existence, recorded and written by many different authors from countless eras and ethnicities. It's made up of about every single genre of literature you can imagine, and it even contains some genres that don't exist outside of the canon of Scripture. It's choppy and lacking in continuity at times. It's beautiful and heartwarming at others. It's challenging, perplexing, frustrating, and mystifying. This book is a wild ride if you give it any amount of time. And I've come to find that every person, whether it's the people in our church or just people that I interact with on a regular basis, have sometimes a complicated relationship with the Bible. But for sure, everybody has sort of different experiences with the Bible, right? And it has to do with how you were brought up. That has to do with your circumstances currently. It has to do with your future hopes and dreams. There's so many things that play into our relationship with the Bible. This is the Bible that my grandfather on my mom's side gave me not long before he passed away. And I used it to preach at his funeral, as a matter of fact. It's one of many study Bibles that he had. It's one of many commentaries and, sort of like books that would unpack different parts of the Scriptures. And he gave me one of them. And he kind of distributed the rest of them among my siblings and other friends and family that were close to him. If you were to thumb through this, you would see a lot of markings and a lot of highlighting and a lot of sticky notes and a lot of just sort of my Grandpa Phil all over the inside of this thing. And one of the things that made Grandpa Phil unique and something that I always envied about him is that he took this Bible at face value. He would read it, he believed whatever it had to say, and it would shape the way he lived. And I'm envious of the simplicity by which he lived his life. That isn't to say that he was aloof or unintelligent. He was one of the most intelligent people I'd ever met. But the way he approached this Bible was to accept it and to receive it as it was and to go and live it out. That's the way that he saw the Bible. My grandfather on my dad's side was extremely different. A believer, loved the Bible, read the Bible constantly, but not like sit down, morning quiet time. Every time he cracked the Bible, he went to war. Every time he opened up this book, he was trying to gut it and figure out what its insides were made of. He was trying to make sense of the thing every single time he opened it. An engineer by trade, he saw it as a machine or a piece of software that he could sort of take apart and understand the inner workings of it. And he was constantly frustrated and perplexed by things like the doctrines of inerrancy and inspiration, two doctrines that have plagued and sort of obsessed me at times throughout my life. On more than just a biblical level, I resonate deeply with this particular grandfather. I'm very envious of those who can read the Bible and just take it and go with it. And there are some of you in this room that fit that description. I think that's a beautiful expression of faith. But there are a lot of people in this room, myself included, who have a complicated, frustrating, sometimes fraught relationship with the Bible. We wrestle with this thing every time we open it up. Every time we take a look at its stories and its teachings, we go, really? Or how? Or why? We ask really interesting questions about these things. The text that I'm going to read today has some elements to it that are frustrating to me. There's some elements to it that are confusing and perplexing, and that's how some of you will receive it as well. But if you're new around here especially, I want to let you in on a culture that we've worked really hard to cultivate around here. That is that the Bible is meant to move us toward a healthy relationship with both God and the world around us, and being right about it is not a prerequisite for its efficacy to that end. The Bible is meant to move us in a healthy direction toward God and towards the world around us, and being right, quote, about it is not a prerequisite for its efficacy to that end. It can be very, very much a motivator to move us towards God and other people and the world around us without us being right about anything about it. That means that we can disagree about it, we can be wrong about it, we can wonder about it, we can change our minds about it. You can think something different about the Bible today that you didn't think a couple years ago, and that doesn't mean that you're any less a follower of the way of Jesus. This book is dynamic, and it is alive, and it is wild and unruly. And it is one of our jobs as followers of the way of Jesus to sort of tame it as much as we can so that it can become a part of the way that we live. But that requires work for many of us. And I realize that might make some of you uncomfortable, that your pastor struggles with the Bible and that I wrestle with it and I have doubts about it and I wonder things about it. There are going to be times, maybe even this very morning, where you disagree strongly with something that I say about the Bible. And I want you to know that that is okay, and that is not a prerequisite. Agreeing with me is not a prerequisite to belonging to this community. This community is a body of believers, people with a common vision, a common mission. The source of that mission and that vision is God teaching us and shaping us and moving us to follow the way of Jesus. And the Bible is a huge part of that, but our agreement and alignment on it isn't always the most necessary thing for us to continue to do that work. And so, without further ado, I'm going to jump into the longest teaching text I have ever read in a homily. So, buckle up. Exodus chapter 14. This is a story that will be familiar to you if you have spent any time around church, or even if you haven't. It's probably a story that you have heard before, or at least mention of it at different times. I want to read it its entirety because it's really a fascinating story, and there's a lot that we tend to miss in our Sunday school childhood versions of it. So here we go in verse 5. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about them and said, "What have we done? We have let the Israelites go and have lost their services." So he and his chariots made ready and took his army with him. He took 600 of the best chariots along with all the other chariots of Egypt with officers over all of them. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, so that he pursued the Israelites who were marching out boldly. The Egyptians, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen and troops, pursued the Israelites and overtook them as they camped by the sea near Pi-hahiroth, opposite Baal-zephon. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us out to the desert to die? Why have you done this to us to bring us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone. Let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance of the Lord he will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still." The Lord said to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide the water so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them, and I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all of his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I gain glory through Pharaoh and his chariots and his horsemen." Then the angel of God, who had been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from the front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to one side and light to the other side, so neither went to the other all night long. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with strong east winds and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued them, and all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. During the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. He jammed the wheels of their chariots so that they had difficulty driving, and the Egyptians said, "Let us get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen." Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and the horsemen and the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on the right and on their left. That day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord, and they put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant. This is a message from the Lord. Thanks be to God. Now, in short order, I'm going to recap this story with giving some special insight in some particular parts. I'm going to talk about what makes me uncomfortable and probably makes some of you uncomfortable about this particular text. I'm going to offer a potential solution to that discomfort. The solution itself may make some of you uncomfortable. And then finally, I'm going to talk about a motif that we have seen over and over again and will continue to see throughout the Old Testament that is viable and important and vital for our health and well-being as spiritual people today. Ready? Here we go. First, a recap. It seems that almost immediately after the Israelites leave Egypt, Pharaoh turns his chariots and his entire army toward them. It's probably a little bit of a gap, maybe a couple of days before they get everyone together and chase after the Israelites. They're on chariots and the Israelites on foot. If they left the same day, they would have caught the Israelites immediately and killed them. There's some time that passes in between those two. And during that time, Pharaoh's heart becomes hard once again for an 11th time. We spent a lot of time talking about the plagues and the meaning of kind of like that entire storyline of the plagues and why 10, and I talked a little bit about that. But the paragraph here that describes the hardening of Pharaoh's heart again is not dissimilar to the way that the plagues themselves were described, and this almost appears to us as like an 11th plague. The main difference here is that Pharaoh does not have a hard heart in the way that he did in the past where his heart was indifferent towards other people. No, he takes action here. He is proactive. He goes after these people. It's very different than him retreating and doing nothing. He's doing the exact opposite. He gathers his entire army, 600 chariots and then some, and sends it after them to annihilate them. And the entire nation of Egypt panics. They panic. They realize the economic and sociological effects of this decision to let their entire labor force leave. They had free labor, and they had built an entire nation on the backs of an enslaved people. In the United States in the mid-1860s, when the Emancipation Proclamation was proclaimed and when the 13th Amendment ratified and many other pieces of legislation sort of around the issue of enslaved people were created, it became illegal to hold slaves in the United States. And Southern slaveholders panicked. They panicked because all of a sudden they realized that the scope of the ranches and the farms and the livelihoods that they had created was dependent upon free slave labor. What will we do without them? We can't pay people to work this land. It's way too big. There's way too much produce. There's way too much happening here. We can't hire people to replace all these people who are working for us for free. What are we going to do? And in that process, many of them drove themselves into their own version of poverty, whether it was actual poverty or some sort of mental poverty. They sowed oppression and they reaped their own poverty and panic. They had sowed oppression over years, and the result of that was many of them dying penniless, many of them having no legacy to pass on to the next generation. And I think that was exactly what they sowed for generations leading up to that. The panic that they felt was very similar to the panic of the Egyptians because all of a sudden their livelihood was at stake. Their legacy was at stake. What will we have left once our slave labor leaves? That panic was similar both in the U.S. and in Egypt. They had built a great nation on the backs of slaves in Egypt. We had built a great nation in the U.S. on the backs of slaves and on stolen land. And the result was panic when it looked like those things would be taken away. In the meantime, the Israelites are instantaneously regretting their decision to leave. They complain immediately to Moses. They're like days out from being free. And they're like, why did you do this to us? We really wanted to stay. Didn't you hear us say that we really wanted to stay? There's no record of them saying that. I think that there's a classic sort of experience of the grass is always greener on the other side. When you're being faced with an army that's going to kill you by the sword, you feel like dying maybe in slavery of natural causes would maybe be just a little bit better. And they start to look back, which is so classic and so common for us. They thought that freedom meant prosperity. They thought that freedom meant comfort. And we do the exact same thing. We think in our minds that if I can be free in this way, I will also experience prosperity in that way. Freedom does not mean prosperity. And by the way, prosperity does not mean freedom. There are a lot of people who live free and clean and not prosperous at all. And there are a lot of people who live prosperous but enslaved to their own prosperity. Well, there's a lot of people who live their lives that way. You may resonate with one of those two things, not having much, but feeling free and clean and ready to go. And there are some people who live in prosperity and they're enslaved to that. And the people of God, as they exit Egypt, are faced with the reality we are free and we have nothing. We are free and we are massively uncomfortable. We are free and our lives are immediately in danger. And they spend the next 40 years being completely dependent on God on a daily basis for what they need in order to subsist. Moses tells them to not be afraid. And then he says, you need only be still. And we kind of take that when we read it as like Moses is taking this like pastoral, like comforting, like, hey, be still and know that God is there. He loves you. Everything's going to be fine. But he's actually very annoyed. You can tell from the grammar and you can tell from the way that things play out after that. He's pretty upset. And when he says only be still, he's saying, shut up. I'm so tired of your complaining. I just helped you be liberated. Like I just got you out of slavery and you're already complaining to me. And now I have to take that to Yahweh and he's going to talk to me. And I don't like it when he has to talk to me because he usually is mad at me, you know? And then we see that exact thing play out. And Yahweh's like, why are your people complaining immediately? So when he says only be still, he means shut up, please. Quit complaining. We're on our way. Just hang in there. You're going to see something amazing today. And then sure enough, that's exactly what happened. Now, 2 times in the next paragraph, Yahweh says something that's extremely important. He says, I will gain glory through Pharaoh and his army. I will gain glory through Pharaoh and his army. And we see sort of the introduction of this word glory, this term glory. It's been used before in the Bible. This isn't the first time we see it, but the concept starts to take shape in a unique way. Here's a few things that we learn about glory that will be important for your reading of the rest of the Old Testament. Glory, in this case, is spoken of quantitatively. It's something that can be gained and it's something that can be lost. It's something that grows or something that shrinks. Glory is quantitative. Glory is also has a giver. In this case, the Israelites are the ones who give Yahweh glory. They're the ones who express glory to him. Glory also has a receiver. Yahweh, God, is the receiver of glory, the receiver of this thing that becomes more and more significant to Israel over time. And then fourthly, glory has a medium. Pharaoh and his army are the conduit by which glory is given from the Israelites to Yahweh. Glory is quantitative. It has a giver, it has a receiver, and it has a medium. The word itself in the Hebrew language connotes weight or heaviness. It connotes a growing presence. So when God says, I will gain glory, he doesn't mean that I will become more glorious. What he means is my glory will become more recognized. It will become more realized and more acknowledged. I will become heavier, so to speak, to the people of God. I will become more present and more sort of like known because of my size, my weight in their presence. This is what he's saying when he says, I'll gain this through this experience. That is his ultimate goal. And we'll see that play out very, very specifically here right at the end of this story. Now, we have the parting of the actual sea itself. This is a fascinating story. Historians have racked their brains and studied the landscape of the Middle East for like 1,000 years to figure out exactly what went down, how did it happen, what can we know about it. And the truth of the matter is we have in this text oftentimes a translation that says the Red Sea, and in our minds we think, yeah, there's the Red Sea that was parted. And then you go look at a map and you'll see that the Red Sea is this massive sea with Saudi Arabia and Yemen on one side and Egypt and Sudan on the other side. And if it was parted, even at its like most narrow spot, if it was parted and the Israelites were to cross over there, it would have taken them like a year to get across it because it's huge. It's absolutely massive. There's no way that is the sea that God parted for them to cross. And so that leaves us looking at the text and going like, well, what is it actually that was parted so they could cross? And you find in the Hebrew text that it's actually referred to as the Sea of Reeds, which is extremely unhelpful. The Sea of Reeds is not descriptive of any body of water anywhere in that area at all. There's no way, or in some ways it's descriptive of like every body of water. Like it's not a good name for a sea. We have no idea what it actually was. There is even a possibility that whatever body of water they cross is no longer there. It could easily have dried up in the thousands of years that have passed from that time till now. We know that we get the sense that it was a quick-ish crossing. which means that it was probably something more like a lake. I remember seeing a documentary one time when I was in high school because I was really into this kind of thing because I guess I was just sort of a nerd for Bible stuff in high school. But I remember seeing a documentary one time where these guys went out and they were like, we're going to find the Sea of Reeds and we're going to find like the real Mount Sinai and we're going to figure out exactly the path that they traveled and whatever. And they found this lake out there and the lake had like a sandbar going right through the middle. And so if the wind really kicked up really, really hard, it could maybe move like a foot of water so they could pass on this sandbar. And then on the other side of the lake, there was this mountain and it had like a burn spot on it. They're like, well, that's where God came down and gave them the law. You know, they had all this stuff figured out. And it was like this cool like detective story. And I loved it. I was super there for it. And then I look at it now and I'm like, maybe, I don't know. Like historically, we have very little information on exactly what happened and how it happened right here. But the purpose of the way this story is written, the purpose of the literary structure of it has nothing to do with the historicity of it. And it has everything to do with mirroring and matching the creation story in Genesis 1. You see two sort of bodies of water that are divided, and as they're divided, they're exposing dry land. This is exactly what happens with the water below and the water beneath in Genesis chapter 1. And we see exposed the earth below. We see dry land exposed. The thing that is dividing the water, the Hebrew word for it in the book of Exodus is ruach, which means wind or spirit. It's the same spirit or wind that divided the waters in the creation story. We see dry land below because the Spirit of God separates the water, and through that there is a deliverance. There is a creation. In the creation story, it's a creation of humanity. After this is where we see humanity and animals and plant life. All of that is created after these waters are separated. And in this particular story, we see the waters separated and a people, a humanity, a nation is delivered through the water. The motif is carried out throughout the rest of the Old Testament in a number of different ways. It was even present in the flood with Noah and his boat. It's something that we see in the New Testament when we see a rebirth or when the people of God are reborn into salvation. To be born again, a term that you've probably heard before, is meant to be reborn, to be delivered, to become a new creation. We see this motif throughout the whole thing. And this is a massive part of that, carrying on that story. And finally, this section of the book of Exodus ends with something that God started out after at the very beginning of the book. It was for him to receive glory, and he receives exactly that. The Israelites are downright enamored with him, not just because he saved them, but because he does so in spectacular fashion, which aligns with something that we said a week or two ago when we said that God delivers in power. God delivers in power, and he puts that on display right here. This isn't just any sort of like regular old deliverance and liberation. He does so with power. He makes a splash, literally and figuratively, because this now can be a part of their history books. This is now something they will tell from generation to generation, and it's a story we still tell today because it was so powerful. But here's my issue with the text. Here's my problem with the text, and it's probably a problem that you have too. A lot of people still died. A lot of people still died. And I don't know if you've ever tried to describe this story to a child, but they'll pick up on this right away. Dad, aren't all people God's children? Well, yeah. Well, then why would he kill so many in the Red Sea situation? It's a good question. Wait, doesn't God love everybody? And you always tell us like we should love everybody because God loves everybody. But then like in this story, I mean, it's cool that the Israelites make it, but God kills a lot of people in this story. What are we supposed to do with that? It's a great question, kids. And I don't have a super, super clean answer for it, but I do have something. I've spent a little bit of time, a fair amount of time actually, like studying this and trying to understand this from a historical perspective. I've listened to lots of commentators sort of across the spectrum of opinion on this. There's definitely ways to sort of make this make sense from a historical standpoint, but the thing that is most compelling to me and seems to be the most true is that this might not be a historical account of exactly what happened. That over centuries, perhaps, generations for sure, as this story was written and rewritten and told and retold, that as it was edited from the future, kind of looking back into the past, that this story became something of a symbol. This story became something that helped the Israelite people know who they were and who their God was. And at that time, it would have been fully acceptable for a God to kill a whole lot of people who were your enemy. You see, and I've said this before, but you'll remember that when two nations went to war, it was never one nation versus the other. It was their gods versus your gods. There was never two people who were fighting against each other. It was the gods that they claimed or the gods that they had prayed to or the gods they were connected to that were fighting against each other. And one of the predominant ways that a god would reign victorious over another set of gods or another single god was by killing the army that was represented by that god. That was classic in the ancient Near East. It was a war in the heavenly realms. And so when you were victorious in any sort of war, it was your God who had done the killing. It was your God who had done the destroying. It was your God who was reigning victorious over the other gods. That was the way the story would have been understood. It was the way the story would have been told over and over again, even if it wasn't exactly what happened. That's the way the story would have been interpreted and understood. And so it's very possible, something amazing happened here, that's for sure. I have no doubt in my mind that the people of God were enslaved by Egypt. I have no doubt in my mind that they were miraculously and against all odds delivered from the hands of slavery. And there's no doubt in my mind that there was some sort of epic battle or some sort of epic story that took place. Some amazing plot line happened there. Whether or not it was exactly this and it was all done by the hand of Yahweh himself, I don't know. It doesn't square with the way I've come to understand God. The way I've come to understand God is grace and mercy and love and acceptance. It's hard for me to see that. And so there is a possibility here, at least, that this is not a blow-by-blow, historical, factual recounting of exactly what happened. But the point remains the same. We talked a couple of weeks ago that sometimes we look at like the 10th plague, or we look at this crossing of the sea, and we get so distracted by the death count, by the casualties, that we forget the point of the story. And the point of the story is that God delivers his people in power and he receives the glory as a result. And I don't think that God is done doing this, by the way. I think God continues to deliver, God continues to liberate, and we get to be a part of that story. One of the things you'll often hear us say around here is that we get to join God in the work that he's already doing in the life that you're already living. I am not under the delusion that in 2016, when we had our first worship gathering here, that somehow like that's when God started working in Inglewood. I am not under the opinion in any way that if it were not for this church or were not for us planting a church, or this would just be some sort of like godless wasteland. God was here working before we came along, and God will continue to work here in Inglewood, regardless of our position and our power here in the city as a church. God is working and moving in all areas and elements of our life, and we get the invitation to join him in that work. The thing that keeps us from doing it, one of the most common barriers for us joining him in that work, is the fact that we don't always recognize it when it's happening. We have a hard time sometimes recognizing what is even the work of God, and how do I step into that, and how do I do it? And we've had such a limited imagination for what is the work of God that we oftentimes miss, 90% of God's work because we're so focused on this little bit that might be God's work, and we miss all these other things. So what does God's work look like? We see it shown in the motif yet again in this particular story about deliverance. We see God's creation, destruction, and recreation. Creation, destruction, and recreation. This pattern, this cycle is one of the primary ways that God works in the world. And when we see this cycle, when we see this pattern, it is the work of God, and we get to join in on it. I think I told you a couple weeks ago that we see it, in a variety of different ways. We see it within our own bodies. We see it within our own families. We see it in nature and in the seasons. Right now, we're sort of like approaching the destruction phase of the seasons. And in the spring, we'll see recreation, and we'll go through that process all over again. Every single year, we cycle through that. We see it in the institutions and the structures and systems in our society. I've mentioned this before, one of my favorite shows is an HBO show called The Newsroom, and in it, one of the main characters, Will McAvoy, says, I think it's in season 2, he says every 2 years, we go to a fire station and we overthrow the government, and there's not a policeman in the street. What he means by that is that we create a government as a democracy every couple of years, and then we go and destroy it by voting. That's how we do that. And it's not illegal and it's not wrong. We have our own little sort of revolution every couple of years when we go and we overthrow our government. There's a creation and there's a destruction and there's a recreation, and we get to join in that process. You'll start to see it everywhere you go when you have that as your lens of like, this is one of the primary ways that God works. You'll start to see it in your own soul. You'll see it in the souls of others. You'll see it in the life that you're living everywhere. God creates and he destroys and he recreates, and we get to be a part of that process. There's an invitation there. Regardless of the details of the story that might make you uncomfortable or that you resonate, or maybe you take at face value, and I want to reiterate, that is completely fine if you take the whole story at face value. Regardless of those things, the point of the story is that God continues to liberate with power, and we get to join in. We get to be a part of that. We're invited into that story. He did not do this once and it was done. He keeps doing it, and we get to join in on that. My hope is that you'll start to see it everywhere you go. You'll jump in every chance you get. And every time you see something created, destroyed, recreated, that you'll know that's the work of God, and I get to be a part of that. What an incredible invitation. Would you pray with me? Heavenly Father, thank you for an opportunity to consider what it means, what these stories even mean. It's perplexing and frustrating so many times, and yet it is such a privilege to have these stories at our fingertips and to learn about your character and your nature and the shape of our faith through these stories. We thank you for that, Lord. We pray these things in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen.